America owes $40 trillion. That's $40,000 billion. And here's the uncomfortable part. Somebody owns every dollar of that debt. So who exactly is America borrowing all this money from? China? Japan? Banks? Millionaires? Your retirement fund? And here's the question that should probably make you a little uncomfortable. What happens if America can't keep paying the interest? Because this isn't some imaginary number sitting on a computer screen. America is now spending roughly $1 trillion a year just paying interest on its debt, and the debt has crossed $40 trillion for the first time in history. So how did America get here? Who owns the debt? How does it affect ordinary Americans? And perhaps most importantly, how much longer can the world's largest economy keep carrying it? Let's go back to the beginning, because America's debt problem didn't suddenly appear one morning. The United States has been borrowing money for almost as long as it has existed. In fact, America's first major debt came from the Revolutionary War. The new country needed money to fight Britain, so the government borrowed. And after the war ended, somebody had to pay the bill. That sounds familiar, except the bill has gotten slightly larger, a lot larger. The early United States actually took its debt pretty seriously. Under the leadership of Alexander Hamilton, the government worked to establish credibility with lenders and build a system for managing the country's obligations. The idea was simple. If America borrowed money, investors needed to believe America would pay it back, and for a long time, the national debt moved up and down depending on what was happening in the country. Wars pushed it higher. Economic growth and government surpluses could bring it back down. Then came the Civil War. The government needed enormous amounts of money to finance the war effort, so it borrowed heavily, and once again, America's debt exploded. But here's something important. Having debt isn't automatically a bad thing. That's one of the biggest misconceptions about government debt. Think about it this way. If you borrow money to buy something that helps you produce more money later, the debt can potentially make sense. A company might borrow money to build a factory. A person might borrow money to buy a house. A government might borrow money to build roads, bridges, schools, or other infrastructure. The real question isn't simply, does America have debt? The real question is, what is America doing with the money, and can the economy support the cost of that borrowing? And that's where things get interesting, because America's debt didn't just grow, because the government occasionally needed money for a war. Over the decades, the United States built an enormous system of government spending, taxation, borrowing, and economic policy. And whenever the government spends more money than it collects in taxes, it has a deficit, and that deficit has to be financed, usually by borrowing. Think of it like this. If you earn $100 but spend $120, you're short $20. That's your deficit. If you keep doing that year after year, you don't just have a deficit, you start accumulating debt. And that's basically what the United States has been doing, year after year, deficit after deficit, and the debt keeps stacking up. But then something happened that made the numbers explode. The financial crisis. In 2008, the American financial system nearly collapsed. The government and Federal Reserve responded with extraordinary measures designed to stabilize the economy and financial system. Then came another enormous shock, COVID-19. The government spent trillions of dollars supporting households, businesses, healthcare systems, and the broader economy. And while those measures were intended to prevent an even deeper economic disaster, they also contributed to a massive increase in government borrowing. And now, we've arrived at the number that sounds almost fictional, $40 trillion. But what does that actually mean? Let's put it into perspective. A million is 1,000,000. A billion is 1,000 million, and a trillion is 1,000 billion. Now take that trillion and multiply it by 40. That's the scale we're talking about. But there's another number you need to understand before we go any further. GDP, Gross Domestic Product. It sounds like something invented by economists specifically to make conversations boring, but it's actually pretty simple. GDP is basically the total value of the goods and services produced by a country's economy over a period of time. Think of it as a rough measure of the size of an economy. So if someone says America's GDP is around tens of trillions of dollars, they're talking about the enormous economic activity happening across the entire country. Businesses producing things, people working, companies selling services, consumers buying products, factories manufacturing goods, the whole economic machine. And this gives us a useful comparison. America's national debt is now larger than the value of everything the American economy produces in an entire year. That's an important distinction. It doesn't mean America has to somehow find $40 trillion tomorrow. Government debt isn't a bill that arrives in the mailbox with a giant red Pay Now stamp. The United States continues to operate, collect taxes, grow its economy, and refinance its debt. But the size of the debt matters, because debt comes with interest, and interest is where things start getting uncomfortable. Imagine you borrow $100. If the interest rate is small, the cost might not feel like much. Now, imagine borrowing $40 trillion. Even a relatively small interest rate suddenly produces a gigantic bill. And America is already spending roughly $1 trillion a year on interest payments. That's money that doesn't build a new bridge, it doesn't pay for a new school, it doesn't fund a military operation, it doesn't give someone a tax refund. It's simply the cost of borrowing money in the past. And this is where the debt becomes more than just a giant number. It becomes part of the government's yearly budget. But there's an even bigger question. Who actually owns America's debt? Because if America owes $40 trillion, who is sitting on the other side of that IOU? And the answer is probably not what you think. China gets mentioned a lot, Japan gets mentioned too. And yes, foreign countries do own significant amounts of U.S. Treasury securities. But foreign governments aren't the biggest owners of America's debt. A huge portion is actually owned inside the United States. The Federal Reserve owns some. American banks and financial institutions own some, pension funds own some, mutual funds own some, insurance companies own some, and individual investors can own Treasury securities too. So here's the strange part. Some of America's debt is effectively money that Americans owe to other Americans. Your retirement system can be connected to government debt. Financial institutions can hold it, investment funds can hold it, and millions of ordinary people can indirectly have exposure to it. So when you hear, America owes money, the next question should be, to whom? Because debt isn't just about the person borrowing, it's also about the person lending. And U.S. Treasury debt is considered one of the most important financial assets in the world. Why? Because the United States has historically been viewed as an extremely reliable borrower. The government issues Treasury securities, investors buy them, the government promises to pay interest and eventually return the principal. And because the US dollar is the world's dominant reserve currency, demand for US government debt has remained enormous. This is one of the reasons America can carry a level of debt that would be extremely difficult for many other countries. But that doesn't mean there are no consequences. And this is where the story starts affecting ordinary Americans, because government debt can influence the economy in ways that aren't immediately obvious. More borrowing can mean more interest payments. Higher interest payments can put pressure on government budgets. And if investors demand higher interest rates to lend money, borrowing can become even more expensive. That can ripple through the economy. Mortgage rates, business loans, car loans, investment decisions, government spending. Everything is connected. And here's the part that makes the whole thing more complicated. America doesn't just have debt. America also has an enormous economy. And that's why economists don't look at the debt number by itself. They often compare debt to GDP, because owing $1 trillion is very different for a person earning $30,000 a year than it is for someone earning $30 million. The same idea applies to countries. The size of the economy matters. If the economy grows faster than the cost of servicing the debt, the burden can become easier to manage. But if debt grows rapidly while economic growth remains weak, that's when the situation becomes more difficult. And there's another problem. The debt can become self-reinforcing. The government borrows money. That creates interest payments. Those interest payments increase government spending. If spending exceeds revenue, the government may need to borrow even more. And now you're borrowing to help pay for previous borrowing. It's not quite a financial treadmill, but it's definitely not a treadmill you want to accidentally speed up. So does America have to pay off all $40 trillion? Not necessarily. This is another thing people often misunderstand. Governments don't usually operate like a household trying to reach a zero balance. The United States can issue new debt to replace old debt as it comes due. This is called refinancing. As long as investors continue to trust the government and demand for Treasury securities remains strong, the system can continue. But that trust is incredibly important, because the entire machine depends on people believing that the United States will continue to honor its obligations. And this brings us to the biggest question: what happens if that trust disappears? If investors suddenly become much less willing to buy U.S. debt, the government could be forced to offer higher interest rates to attract buyers. Higher rates mean higher borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs mean larger interest payments, and larger interest payments create even more pressure on the budget. That's the nightmare scenario. Not necessarily that America wakes up one morning and discovers its debt has magically disappeared, but that the cost of maintaining that debt becomes increasingly difficult. And there's another uncomfortable issue. America has something almost no other country has at the same scale: the world's dominant reserve currency, the US dollar. Countries around the world hold dollars. International trade uses dollars. Financial institutions use dollars. Central banks hold dollar reserves. And US Treasury securities are deeply embedded in the global financial system. That creates enormous demand for American debt. In a strange way, the world needs US government debt, and that gives America a privilege that most countries simply don't have. But privileges can create bad habits, because when borrowing is relatively easy, it's very tempting to keep borrowing. And that's the central problem with America's $40 trillion debt. It's not that debt automatically means collapse. It doesn't. The United States is still an enormous economy. It still has a huge tax base. It still has the world's most widely used reserve currency. And investors still demand US Treasury securities. The real question is whether the debt continues growing faster than the economy's ability to comfortably support it. Because eventually, numbers stop being abstract. Interest payments become real budget decisions. More borrowing becomes more interest, and more interest means fewer choices. That's what makes the $40 trillion number so important. It's not just a giant number designed to scare you. It's a claim on future government resources, a claim that has to be managed, and eventually, somebody pays for it, maybe through taxes, maybe through spending cuts, maybe through economic growth, maybe through some combination of all three. But the bill doesn't simply disappear. And perhaps that's the strangest thing about America's debt. The United States isn't necessarily in trouble because it owes $40 trillion. It's in a much more complicated position, because America has managed to build something incredibly powerful: an enormous economy, a dominant currency, a massive financial system, and an enormous amount of trust. The question is, how long can all four continue growing while the debt grows even faster? Because $40 trillion isn't just America's debt, it's a bet that the American economy will keep growing, a bet that investors will keep trusting the dollar, a bet that the government will keep paying its bills, and a bet that the future will be richer than the present. So the real question isn't, can America pay $40 trillion tomorrow? It can't, and it doesn't need to. The real question is whether America can keep carrying the debt while continuing to grow, while keeping interest costs under control, and while convincing the rest of the world that the American financial system is still the safest place to put money. Because if that confidence ever changes, the number on the debt clock might be the least interesting thing to watch. The interest rate will be, the dollar will be, the bond market will be, and eventually, so will your wallet. This is Casual History, where the biggest stories about money, wealth, power, and the people who control them aren't just history. They're warnings about how the world works.